Alright, so today's going to start a series of 3 lectures on interspecific interactions. So interactions between individuals or populations from different species. And I want to start out with this table that sort of breaks down sort of an easy way to think about the different types of interspecific interactions. Today we're going to talk about mutualism. And so mutualism is a situation where the 2 species involved are both benefiting. Okay, so in this table I represented that as effect on species A is positive, effect on species B is positive. Commensalism is sort of a closely related type of interaction where there's a benefit to one of the species and the other species doesn't really seem to be helped or hurt by the relationship. They're not really affected. Later on we'll talk about exploitation, where one of the species is benefiting and the other is being hurt. So predation is sort of the primary example. When we talked about parasitism and zombies, that would be a good example of exploitation. Both of those fit there. And then finally we'll talk about competition, where both species are actually negatively affected. They would both benefit if the other was not there. But before we get going, I'd like to give you a question that has sort of multiple answers. So I'm going to open up this soapbox question. Which of these describes our relationship with cows? So I want you to try and think about why you're picking either mutualism, commensalism, exploitation, or competition. Because we're going to talk about it after you buzz in. But I'm curious to see what you all think. Okay, so the majority of you think that we are exploiting cows, but a substantial proportion of you think that that's not the best way to explain this relationship. So, what was your reasoning? Yeah.
Well, they're encased and they're mass produced to like have either make milk or like dairy products instead of just being open and like giving it to us. Like,
So I'm going to guess you said exploitation.
Right, yes.
Yeah, Rossi?
So we are the reason that the cow population is this big to begin with. Like we help them become, this big.
So the cow population would not be the size it is if it were not for us. So that makes it what? What is it?
Mutualism.
Mutualism? So we benefit and the cows benefit from the situation. Anybody on the, yeah, go ahead.
Well, the domesticated cow's sole purpose is to aid us. Like, we domesticate it so we can drink its milk, eat its meat. So, it's commensalism, how we pronounce that, because it's positive for us, but it doesn't really affect the cow because the cow's just there for a job.
Yeah. Commensalism means that you don't think it's a benefit, a cost or a benefit to the cows, I'm assuming, right? So you don't think it hurts them, but you don't really think it helps them either.
No.
They just are, and
there.
they would be the same if we weren't interacting with them. Does that make you want to change it?
No.
Okay. All right. So let's think about the currency that we're talking about here. What is the positive and what is the negative here? You really have to start thinking about evolutionary fitness. Okay. You really have to think about population size growth, for example, would be a good measure. You know, would especially when we're talking about competition, if there are 2 birds that inhabit very similar niches, if this species A wasn't here, species B would have a larger population size. So if we define it strictly on population size, does that change anybody's opinion? I have to say, I think that by that strict definition, I agree with Rossi. I think that mutualism is the best way to explain it. Even though you think it's exploitation, you don't think, you know, our treatment of cows is poor and all of that, but if you look at it just from the perspective of population size.
Yeah, I understand that, but the way they're breeding them, they're like, I would say they're closely related also, because they're using the same cows from the same like ranch or whatever they, you know.
In other words, even though there are a lot of individuals, the genetic diversity of the cow species might actually be impacted in a negative way.
Yeah.
That's an interesting way to look at it. Yeah, okay, one more, and then we gotta move on.
Not to be crude, but there's a reason why bull semen is the most expensive liquid, because people do that a lot. They like, you know, use bulls from different ranches to like.
Excellent counterpoint. So
What?
instead of worrying about the diversity, Rossi is thinking about the superiority of the new cows that have resulted from our breeding.
From genetic modifications?
We could go down a rabbit hole here. Let's move on. Good job. That was great. I like that. Okay. Okay, so I only have one review question here, and that's just, I want you to know this table. I want you to know that mutualism is positive, positive. Competition is negative, negative, and the others in between. Okay, so it just says, know the effect that each type of interspecific interaction has on species involved in the interaction. Any questions? Okay. All right, so I want to start out with one of the most famous mutualisms, and that's the relationship between flowers and their pollinators. Flowers have not, relatively speaking, relative to other plants, flowering plants have not been around for very long in evolutionary time. Flowering plants evolved during the age of the dinosaurs. At that time, there were no flowering plants until a flower evolved. And then once the flower did evolve, it rapidly, the flowering plant, that clade rapidly diversified and quickly actually outnumbered, in number of species, outnumbered all other types of plants. And they continue to outnumber all types of plants. And part of that diversification is tied to this symbiosis between the pollinators and the plants that they pollinate. So it becomes really beneficial to be only, for a flower to only be able to be pollinated by one particular species of insect, because that means that they can very specifically direct their pollen. The bee isn't coming and taking pollen from this flower and then giving it to giving that pollen to an individual from a different species. Okay, if you can develop a tight relationship with your pollinator such that it can only get food from your flower, your species type of flower, then it goes from your individual flower to another individual of your own species. It becomes very efficient. And because of this specialization between flowers and insects, we see there's a similar pattern in the flowering plants where we go along, and this is the width of this a spot is the number, it represents the number of species. So in the flowering plants we see, you know, one or two flowering plant species, and then it quickly diverges into a huge number of species during this time. And I wanted to show you on the insect end, right around here is where we have the evolution of flowering plants. You can see that in the Diptera, the flies, in the Lepidoptera, the moths and butterflies, and also in the Hymenoptera, especially tightly connected with the Hymenoptera, the bees, wasps, the ants, termites, they're all in there, and flies. There's also an adaptive radiation at that time. Okay, so this is a really important effect of mutualisms on the diversification insects and of plants. Now I'd like to challenge you with a soapbox question. Name a food that is not derived either directly or indirectly from an angiosperm. In other words, a flowering plant. Have any of you had this question before? I gave this in another class. Anybody? I like this question. What's tofu? Soybeans are a flowering plant. Crickets eat plants, a lot of them being flowering plants. Which meat? I mean, let's just go down the line.
Line meat. I win.
What kind of meat? I mean,
it's hard to like. It's only carnivores that really like are the ones that can be chosen as meat.
But even carnivores rely on the food that carnivores eat. Those animals that carnivores eat are herbivores that are often eating flowering plants. Pizza's got wheat in it. It could have tomatoes are a flowering plant. The tomato is the result of a pollinated flower. So pizza doesn't work. Venison, those guys munch on. Actually, there was a deer in my front yard this morning eating. It did eat a non-flowering plant. It did chomp down a white pine, and that's a non-flowering plant. But deer don't live on white pines alone.
Fish is a good one.
Fish is a good one.
Algae and they also.
Algae, that's right. So fish is a good one. Anybody put that one in? Yeah, good. Some fish, as long as they, you know, if they live on like mayflies, and the mayflies are chomping on leaves that came off of trees that were flowering plant trees, then, you know, like trout, trout don't really count because they're eating insects that eat angiosperm leaves.
Mosquitoes.
Seaweed is a good one. Seaweed works. Mushrooms, well done. Mozzarella doesn't work because it's cows and cowsy. You know, whether they're grass is a flowering plant. So even grass-fed. Dirt. I have not seen that in a culinary application, but I could be mud pies, I guess. Cinnamon is the bark of a tree that I believe is a flowering plant. Cinnamon is bark. Yep. Shark might be okay. Tricky.
That's crazy.
All right. Mosquitoes would be okay if they were dining on an animal that wasn't eating flowering plants, but basically everything you eat almost is from a flowering plant. So the mosquitoes that eat you are relying on a flowering plant. Mosquitoes don't work.
But aren't male mosquitoes pollinators and female mosquitoes?
Then they rely on flowering plants. Yeah.
So you said flowering plants evolved after dinosaurs?
Yes.
So what did they, what was the base?
Non-flowering plants.
Big trees.
There were cycads, but those weren't particularly good to eat. We had ferns for sure, but there were also, the conifers. The gymnosperms dominated the world. That's one you guys missed, actually. Gymnosperms give us a very expensive protein. Fiddleheads is a good one, but I'm thinking of pine nuts. Pine nuts. Okay, we better move on.
According to Howard.
Well done. You did much better than the last time I asked, actually. Basically, nobody got any of it right. One person put mushrooms last time. That was the only one right. The next mutualistic relationship that I want to talk about is the relationship between fungus and a plant. So this is called a mycorrhizal symbiosis. And I want to demonstrate right off the bat how important these mycorrhizal symbiosis relationships are. So these are all lemon trees grown in similar conditions. These were grown in a sterile soil that had no fungus. These were grown in the same sterile soil that was inoculated with that particular species of fungus. And so you can see just the addition of that fungus alone resulted in, it seems like, at least double the above ground biomass. And you can see that the roots did pretty well too. Okay, you're not actually looking at fungus down here necessarily. This is mostly plant biomass. And so we're going to come back to that in a big way. I want to move on quickly to one more pretty important mutualism. So hopefully by now, at this point, you guys have heard about the idea that mitochondria were at one time a free-living microbe and just started to sort of hang out with a larger celled microbe, and eventually the mitochondria were engulfed by larger cells but not dissolved. They continued living after they were engulfed. And it was a mutualistically beneficial relationship between the large cell and the mitochondrial cells. Eventually, it became a obligate mutualism. In other words, this cell could not live without its mitochondrial cells that live within it. And the same story is also told about how chloroplasts eventually came to exist inside of eukaryotic cells. So basically, the origin of eukaryotes, almost all animals, all plants, the origin of most of the organisms that you recognize is thanks to a mutualism. At least that's the theory, because this would have happened a really long time ago. We don't have a good way of testing this. Okay, let's talk about review questions. What is the evolutionary advantage flowers obtain from producing nectar that feeds insects and birds?
Cross-pollination.
Pollination.
Distribution.
Yeah, distribution as well, but pollination is the main thing I'm looking for. What two types of organisms work together in a mycorrhizal symbiosis?
Fungi and plants.
Fungus and plants. And what do they each gain from the relationship?
Better root system. The fungus gets food.
So that's really the heart of this. The fungus is sort of like a enhancement to the root system. Okay, so the fungus can pull in water and nutrients from the soil that the plant would not otherwise be able to get. The fungus gives nutrients and water. The plant in return gives the product of photosynthesis. The plant actually gives sugar to the fungus. I'm sorry, I didn't put in a picture for the next one, but I think we can get this one pretty easily. And this is in your Connect homework. The sort of introductory part of the chapter goes over this, so I wanted to have it here in lecture as well. How do the gut microbes benefit from their relationship with the ungulates they inhabit? I'm thinking about the gut microbes that are inside of cows, and in your textbook it talks about deer. So what do they get? They get food, first of all. The microbes get food. They also get a safe place to live. A safe, warm, moist, very stable place to live. And the ungulates, what do the ungulates get? Yeah, the breakdown of that plant matter that wouldn't otherwise happen. So they can actually absorb the nutrients that's in that plant matter. And then finally, explain how the origin of eukaryotic cells might have been made possible by a mutualism. That's the endosymbiotic theory, where organelles were previously free-living cells, but eventually became engulfed, but not digested by larger cells, and engaged in a mutualism that eventually led to eukaryotic cells that have organelles within them. Just explain that one more time. So the idea is that there were free-living cells that very closely resembled present-day mitochondria and chloroplasts. They became associated with larger cells when they were engulfed by those larger cells but not digested. The larger cells and the smaller cells that would become organelles were in a mutualistic relationship at that point, and eventually it became an obligate mutualism, where the large cell and the small cells could not live without each other. They don't exist without each other anymore. Okay, so as I mentioned, I want to come back to mycorrhizal mutualisms and talk about there's two different types. On the left here, you can see an ectomycorrhizal, and although there are fungal cells that are penetrating the plant, those fungal cells do not penetrate the plant cells. Okay, so that's the characteristic that I want you to remember about ectomycorrhizal mutualisms. On the other hand, this other type, the arbuscular mycorrhizal mutualism, involves fungal tissues that not only penetrate the plant, but they penetrate the plant cells. There are actual fungal tissues inside of plant cells. So the exchange doesn't happen extracellularly. The exchange of nutrients and water and sugar actually happens internally inside plant cells. The next thing I want to tell you about mycorrhizal mutualisms is one way that we know that they actually benefit plants. So on the x-axis here, we're looking at time, and on the y-axis, the variable that they were interested in was leaf water potential. Leaf water potential, basically to summarize, is the plant's ability to pull water up out of the ground and send it up to its leaves. And what you should be able to see in this figure is that without a mycorrhizal fungus relationship, plants have a much lower ability at any time during the growth, at any time during the day, to pull water up out of the soil and send it up to their leaves. When you look at this line up here that represents the plants that do have a relationship with the fungus, they have a much better capability of pulling water out of the soil. Now, of course, just having those data don't tell you exactly what's happening under the soil. They don't tell us whether the fungus is actually actively moving water and the fungus is actually participating in pushing water up the plant, or if it's just something about that relationship with the fungus that gives the plant sort of more robust structures that are able to do their job better. And so some researchers went out and did a test where they actually trimmed away the hyphae. They actually trimmed away the fungal hyphae that are pulling in water, and then looked at the plant. And so the presumption there is that if the plant has been in relationship with a fungus as it develops, and then you trim away the hyphae, if the plant is still good at pulling water up from the soil, that means that the fungus doesn't have to be actively attached. It's something about development, right? The plant develops better because it's been in that relationship with the fungus. On the other hand, if you see a precipitous drop in the ability of the plant to pull water up after the hyphae are cut away, after the fungus is removed from the plant, then we would know that the fungus is actually actively participating in increasing that ability for the plant to pull water up. And it is actually the second. It does seem that fungus is directly involved in increasing that leaf water potential. In other words, in the treatment where they cut away the fungus, these guys, even though they started with mycorrhizal fungi, when they had it cut away, they dropped down in their leaf water potential. Let's look at another demonstration of the importance of these mycorrhizal relationships. So there's actually a large section of this chapter dedicated to some research that's summarized in this particular figure. But it got really, really involved, and there were like 5 different variables that were up in the air. And I actually found it pretty hard to understand. And I thought that you guys would probably just get lost, and I would have to spend all of today explaining that experiment. So I decided to skip it, but I want to summarize. Basically, the researchers had some plants, individuals from the same species, that were growing in nutrient-poor soil and a nutrient-rich soil. Okay, and we already know that when you're in a nutrient-poor soil, your root-to-shoot ratio is going to be higher, right? If you're in a nutrient-poor soil, you should invest more in your roots because you're not going to be able to get enough nutrients to support your above-ground biomass if you don't invest a lot in your roots. What was interesting in this experiment is that they also found that the investment in the fungus was greater as well. So they saw much more robust growth of fungus in the poor soil, and they saw more spores. So the fungus was actually proliferating itself more rapidly in the poor soil. So it looks like what this implies is that the evolution of these mycorrhizal mutualisms probably has something to do with plants that went from soils that were good for plant growth to soils that were not so good for plant growth, and they needed some help. All right, review questions. What is the difference between an arbuscular mycorrhizal mutualism and an ectomycorrhizal mutualism?
One's on the inside, one's on the outside.
Yeah, this is all about whether it's on the inside or outside. And you should remember ecto, exit, I don't know, I'm just trying to give you a way to remember this. Ecto is the one that's outside, okay? The arbuscular is the one that actually has fungal tissue inside of the plant cells. Ecto has tissue inside the plant, but not actually inside the cells. In simple terms, what is leaf water potential?
The ability of how much water can be held by the roots.
It's the ability of the plant to pull water up from the roots to the leaves, right? How does mycorrhizal mutualism affect the leaf water potential of plants?
Benefits.
Yeah, it's beneficial to have mycorrhizal association. And what two alternative hypotheses were posed to explain the effect of mycorrhizal mutualism on leaf water potential? So we had these two hypotheses, right, that were possible. One of them is development, right? The reason the plants have a better water leaf potential is because they've developed with an association with a fungus, and so they have developed more robust tissues that are better able to do their job. So I'm calling that the indirect hypothesis. And then on the other hand is the direct hypothesis, where the fungus actually has to be actively working with the plant for that leaf water potential to be higher. Moment of truth, which one was supported? The direct or the indirect hypothesis?
Which one was directly supported?
Which one was supported? The hypothesis that the fungus actually had to be connected for that leaf water potential to be high?
Oh, it was the Allen and the...
Or the one where it's all about development and the fungus doesn't actually have to be
Was it
attached?
Johnson that all...
Be the first one.
Yeah, it's the first one where it, yeah, go ahead.
Okay, I have a question.
Yeah.
So you're saying direct?
Hold on. Yeah, I'll just give the punchline and then ask the question again. All right, so the punchline is the direct hypothesis was supported. The fungus actually has to be connected for that leaf water potential to be high.
That was the first one, right?
Yeah, that's the first one I just explained.
Yeah.
Go ahead with your question though.
That's what I was gonna ask.
You got it?
I'm just gonna clarify that.
So when they cut the fungus away from the plant, does the leaf water potential decline or stay the
I
same?
think it goes down.
It goes down, right? Yep. Okay, and then what evidence supports the hypothesis that nutrient-poor soils favor the evolution of mycorrhizal mutualisms? You guys ready to move on to this one? Okay. It's this last picture that I have. Can somebody try to summarize that? What evidence supports the hypothesis that nutrient-poor soils favor the evolution of mycorrhizal mutualisms?
They need it to grow. Because they're putting more energy into their roots.
Yes, that is true, but I'm thinking specifically about this image that summarizes an experiment that was done.
Oh, so depend nutrient
So root to shoot ratio is one of the keys, yes.
proportional to nutrient rich or nutrient poor.
In the nutrient poor, we had a higher root
Yeah, ratio.
to shoot ratio, right? You had more roots in the nutrient poor.
And nutrient rich, they had a higher shoot ratio compared to lower.
And here we'll say they have lower root
Yeah.
to shoot ratio in the nutrient rich. But more importantly than that even is what actually happens when you look at the fungus. So there's more fungal development. So it seems like the fungus must be getting fed more sugars.
Would the fungus actually join the one on the left side more compared to the right one?
Well, the fungus was present in both.
Okay.
Fungus was present in both of these, but it was more developed in the nutrient-poor soil. The only way that can be, it's not because of the soil that the fungus is able to grow more. It must be because of the plants.
Yeah.
The plant must be investing more in the fungus.
I was helping that.
Ready to move on? Any questions? All right, ants have some really cool mutualisms, so I'm just going to do the whole thing on ants here. Let's start with this video. Let's see how my volume is. Good.
domesticated plants about 12,000 years ago, gotta say, it was a pretty big deal. But it was not a first. Hundreds of ant species, along with some termites and beetles, have been farming for tens of millions of years. Ants practice two forms of farming. Some species farm fungi, and others farm aphids. In both cases, it's a symbiotic relationship where two species have some kind of interaction, but more specifically, it's mutualism, where they both benefit from that relationship. The fungi and aphids can digest things the ants can't, so they provide the ants with nutrients, and in exchange, the ants protect and feed them. There are more than 200 species of ants that farm fungi, and they've been doing it for up to 50 million years. Most of them use dead plant material like leaf litter to cultivate their farms. It's easier for the fungi to digest that dead stuff using enzymes that break it down into nutrients that the ants can then eat. But dead leaf-eating fungi usually can't provide enough food for an entire colony, so the ants have to go eat other stuff too. But over the last few million years, leafcutter ants and their fungus farms have come up with a better way. They use freshly cut living leaves, which are more nutritious for the fungus. Along the way, the fungus evolved to grow nutrient-rich clusters called ganglidia, which the ants eat. And the ants have lost a lot of their ability to digest anything else. You've probably seen pictures like this one of leafcutter ants hauling leaves, but they don't actually eat those leaves. Instead, they chew them up and spit them back out to feed to the fungus garden. Smaller worker ants start the process at the top layers of the garden, breaking the leaves into millimeter-sized bits. But the ants need to help the fungus digest the fresh leaves because the thinner top layer of the garden is the one doing the digesting, and it doesn't have enough enzymes to complete the job. So they poop and spit on it. Ants in lower sections of the nest eat some of the fungus, including its enzymes. Those areas are more densely packed, so they have plenty to spare. Once they've had their fill, they travel back up to the top and excrete those enzymes onto the leaves in the form of saliva and feces. Some fungi farming ants also grow antibiotic-secreting bacteria that rid the fungi of parasites. In other words, the ants are using pesticide on their farms. For some ants, though, fungus isn't their crop of choice. Instead, they farm aphids, tiny insects that feed on plant juices, almost like how humans herd cattle. Aphids eat phloem, the part of a plant that transports sugar, and they excrete a waste product known as honeydew. Honeydew is full of all kinds of sugars like glucose and fructose, and ants tend to prefer aphids whose honeydew also contains more complex sugars called trisaccharides. The ants keep groups of aphids in herds above ground on plants, and all they have to do to get the aphids to produce some honeydew is stroke them, like they're milking a cow. And the ants will go to some extreme lengths to protect their sugary food producers. The ants will keep the aphids sheltered from rain, building structures from leaves, and they'll move them to better feeding plants to maximize honeydew production. They'll also attack ladybugs, which love to feed on aphids if they get too close, even seeking out and destroying ladybug eggs. On the other hand, ants have been known to bite the wings off of aphids to keep them from leaving, and they also secrete some chemicals that stunt wing growth and others that slow aphids down. Sounds kind of harsh, but it could be less of a trap and more of a signal to aphids, basically saying, if you stay here, the ants will protect you. It's a win-win for the colony of tiny farmers and for their herd. Thank you for watching this episode of SciShow, which was brought to you by our patrons on Patreon who make this fascinating content.
Okay, a couple pretty cool examples there. And so those are obligate relationships where he's talking about the ants have lost their ability to digest a lot of things. And the fungus really depends on the ants. The fungus is not found outside of the ant colonies. So they rely on each other 100%. They can't exist without each other. That's an obligate mutualism. I want to tell you about a facultative mutualism. In other words, one where this sunflower can exist without the ants. The ants can exist without the sunflower, but they both benefit from each other. If they do interact, they both benefit. So this sunflower has extra floral nectaries. In other words, it's got places where it secretes sugar that are not inside the flower to attract ants. And they tend to be on the outside of the flower because the quote-unquote goal of the plant, in other words, the benefit to the plant, is that if these ants are hanging around, if these plants are hanging around visiting these extra floral nectaries, they are chasing away insects that are coming around to lay their eggs in this developing flower, and those eggs eventually will become seed predators. Okay, so the plants are being protected by these ants from seed predators. All right, one more ant mutualism, and then we'll talk about the review question.
Whenever a huge tree falls in the Costa Rican rainforest, a gap of sunlight is formed in the canopy. New life competes for this light, like this vine racing this sapling upward. But there's one tree that never has any competition, thanks to an incredible symbiotic relationship it shares with an ant. The swollen thorn acacia and its namesake, the acacia ant, have developed harmonious roles in each other's lives. The ant's role is as protector. If any of those vines try to steal the acacia's light, the ant security guards go to work. A few good chops on the vine stems, and it's lights out for the vine.
Is that all to do?
The ants don't stop there. This relatively huge grasshopper may think it's going to take a few bites out of the non-poisonous acacia, but the ants take a few bites out of it instead. And they throw in a few stings for good measure. In exchange for all this protection, the tree takes on the provider role. It gives the insect everything it needs in terms of food and shelter. These little nodules, or nectaries, secrete a sweet nectar for the adult ants to eat. And these brownish pods at the end of some leaves are the perfect, nutrient-packed food for the ants' developing young, called larvae. The acacia ant larvae live down hollowed-out thorns at the base of the acacia leaves. Some will eventually grow into adults with wings and will fly off to replicate this evolutionary masterpiece in a new acacia.
I wish I had learning of that.
So there's another good example of obligate mutualism, where they both rely on each other. The acacia tree can exist without the ants. It doesn't grow as rapidly, it doesn't have as many leaves because it has herbivores coming along eating the leaves. So in general, the most successful acacia trees are the ones that are in the mutualism with the ants. The ants, on the other hand, cannot exist without an acacia tree. Okay, so just a few review questions here. What do leafcutter ants farm? Fungus. They actually farm fungus and then eat that fungus. They're doing that because it's much harder to break down leaves directly by themselves, so they let the fungus break down the leaves. What product is given to ants by their aphid herds? It's sugar. It's a amino acid rich sugar, complex sugar. And what benefit is provided to the aphids in return?
Protection, right?
Yeah, it's protection. So they're protected from predators like ladybugs. They're also moved around. The ants will actually pick up the aphids and move them to a better location for feeding. So we've covered this next question several times. What is the difference between a facultative mutualism and an obligate mutualism?
Well, isn't it that they're both mutualistic, but they can survive well either of them? It's just facultative, they just help each other.
In facultative, they just help each other is on the right track.
They don't have to live with each other.
Yeah.
In facultative.
Right.
In facultative, they can live without each other. In obligate,
One can live without the other. Right.
yes, at least one of them requires that relationship to live. And then the last question: what services are provided to the ants? And I'm thinking about the acacia ants. I should have said acacia ants there. What services are provided to the ants by the Beltian bodies, the thorns, and the foliar nectaries, the extra floral nectaries of the acacia trees?
So food for the ants, protection, shelter and protection, and food for the larvae.
So what do the thorns do?
Shelter.
That's shelter. And then the Beltian bodies, that video didn't say what Beltian bodies are. Beltian bodies are those pods. Those pods are rich in proteins and lipids. Okay, so the Beltian bodies are really, they're food for raising the young ants. And the nectaries are providing food for the active ants in the form of sugars. Any questions before we go? All right, see you on Friday.
Is that reviewed, sir?
Yeah, Friday is review session.